Liz is a Lib Democrat, a life peer of the House of Lords and the Deputy Speaker of the House of Lords. An absolutely staunch and phenomenal advocate for LGBTQ rights, not only in the UK but also abroad. Involved in the all-party parliamentary groups, the HIV/AIDS APPG and the global LGBTQ rights APPG. So just tireless in her support of LGBTQ people like us. So please could you help me welcome Baroness Barker. Thanks. So yeah, I thought it would be great before we kind of get into all the kind of leadership stuff and the modern day, really just to start where it all began. And just to hear a little bit about your background. I'm sure a lot of people here will be aware of some of your kind of more recent work. But yeah, I wanted to know kind of, yeah, where do you think it kind of all started for you, the kind of road that led you on this journey to where you are today?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Shoesmiths. I'm delighted to be here. I know that other people rate law firms on how good their services are or how much money they save on. I tend to rate city law firms on how good the wine is and what the canapes are like. Just saying. Where did it all begin? Well, I suppose a lot of it began not very far away from here, really. When I was a kid, I grew up in Scotland, so to me you're a southerner.
That's absolutely fair.
Sassenach,
Midlander, maybe Midlander.
And then because of my dad's job, I grew up in Oldham, on the side of the Pennines. And I grew up in this little Lancashire valley, just feeling different. All my life I felt just different, you know. Scots person growing up in Lancashire, you know, I guess I never could really put my finger on it, but always a bit different. Went away to university. Most of the people who went to university, one person got to Oxford. The rest of them did all the JMB universities, for those of you who are that old. So they all went Sheffield, Manchester, Newcastle. Me, I went to Southampton. I got as far away from my family as it was possible to go without getting on a boat, which was something about needing some personal space to grow up. And I am of that truly lucky generation. I got to go to university and people paid me to go to university and go and find out about life all on my own. And after university, I moved to London, and because you could then, you could move to London with no money. I mean, dear God, I wasn't quite Dickensian, but it was, you know, a different world to what it is now. And I kind of, I think the quickest way to say it to you is that I graduated from university in '82 and I moved to London, and I was part of that generation. I was desperately trying to be heterosexual. I'd been really, really bad at it, but trying very hard until it became evident to pretty well everybody except my mum that it wasn't going to work out, really. And then the quickest way to explain it to you is a couple of years ago, in the 1 week, my osteopath and Norman Fowler said to me, "Did you see it's a sin?" And I think when Norman Fowler and your osteopath say, "Did you see it's a sin?" they're kind of trying to tell me something. Because I was of that generation. And in about 1985, 86, 87, my friends started to get ill, and then some of them started to get sick. And so that kind of was one of the big things that happened. The second thing that happened was I had a really good friend, and she had a brilliant idea that she knew precisely 2 lesbians. And she thought, well, they'll like each other, won't they? And therefore she introduced us, and well, what can I tell you? We got married in 2016. When I met her, she worked not very far away from here. She worked in the city, and she worked in the compliance department of a company that should be nameless, Bearing Securities. And she hated it. And after a while, we got together the wherewithal to sort of spring her out of that, and she went off to do something that she really, really wanted to do, which was to be a children's librarian. And the day she left, she went to her boss and she said, "But you know, you don't understand futures and options. You don't understand the computer system. It's entirely possible that somebody, a member of staff, could set up all these accounts, they could do all this trading, and you wouldn't know anything about it." And they went, "Oh, go away." And precisely 2 years later, Dick Leeson brought down Bearing Securities, having done exactly what she said.
Wow.
So, and the thing was that back then, nobody in the city or any of the big professions came out and lived. So nobody did. You know, if you were gay, you stayed well and truly closeted. And that's the story, and that was the story in pretty well all of professional life, and that includes politics. There were no out gay leaders. I mean, the only thing that you could do in those days, and I did it, didn't go to work in the commercial world. The places where gay LGBT people could go and be safe was the civil service, you know, preferably buried deep where nobody could see you, didn't have a public-facing role, but local government or in the charity world. So that's where we all went. And we got lambasted, Looney left council, do you remember all that? And Section 28 came along. And so that was the formative stuff. The idea that, I mean, people weren't out and proud. I mean, when I look back on it, the only people who were out and proud when I grew up were the people who were so flamboyant they couldn't be in. And they got their heads kicked in, you know. And it's why, although I'm not the biggest fan of drag in the world, but I always had tremendous respect for the drag queens, and particularly for what the drag queens did in the early days of HIV. And they were not just, you know, they were there, they were out there, and they took it all, you know, and they were incredibly courageous about it. So it wasn't possible to be out in politics. So standing to be an MP or even a local councillor, I just thought that's not on, because, you know, I mean, a few very brave people did risk it, but, you know, the chances were that you were going to get taken apart by the News of the World or the Sun or the Daily Mail, and so most people just didn't risk that. And people did a number of different things. I did the classic thing. I did lots of backroom jobs and helped other people to get elected, and that's where I was kind of most effective. And years later, I read a book, and it was a book about gay people in the Tory party. And we were talking about a guy called Ian Greer. And Ian Greer is the guy who basically developed public affairs as a profession. And in this book, lots of people were Tories and they were in public affairs. And it was only when I read something and said, well, you couldn't be an MP, so you went off into public affairs. And it suddenly dawned on me that that's why so many gay men were in public affairs, because they couldn't be out. But they were very, very good at being in public affairs. So I tried along for various different reasons. The Blair government got elected. They had to suddenly create lots and lots of peers who were not Tories. And my then party leader, Paddy, with whom I'd worked as a backroom person, said, look, he was a great man in many ways, Paddy. I've been given, one afternoon we were standing having a fag, I'll be honest with you. was always cadging facts. And he said, look, I want you to go in the House of Lords. And I went, yeah, right. He said, no, really, I do. I've got these places to give to people to be members of the House of Lords, and I don't want them to be, quote, boring old farts like me, was what he actually said. What he did was he used his power of appointment to appoint a number of us who were different, who were young, who were very, very different from all the white men who were in the Commons. And I remember saying to him at the time, I said, look, I think there might be a reason why you're doing this. And he said, well, that's not the main reason. And he said, I know what you mean. He said, well, and I said, I can't talk about that. He said, no, I know. So we won't, but one day we will, and that'll be fine. And I was immensely lucky because a whole load of people who could have blown my story were very honourable and didn't, and they colluded in it, and they let me get on with it. And so the worst kept secret in the world, Mrs. Gay, remained just that. I had a very, very important rule. I didn't talk about things publicly ever, and I was never ever hypocritical about anything. And I never ever gave them a reason to have a go at me. And so I didn't. And then the thing that made it possible for me to come out happened, which was basically the oldest reason that my mum died. My mum was from a very religious background, and she really, we never talked about it. She probably couldn't cope with talking about it. She certainly couldn't have coped with reading about it in the newspapers. So we just never did. So after she had died and was no longer around to be hurt by it, I then thought, okay, this is what to do. And I sat and waited, and I had a conversation with Wahid Ali, and he said, okay, make it impactful. So I did. I think I made a speech on the second reading of the Same-Sex Marriage Act, which is on YouTube. You can watch it. I can't.
I'm interested how many people have seen that speech or that moment already. Yeah, a few of you, or it's well worth looking up. It really is.
Thank you. Stephen Fry thinks so. I think he's used it about 3 times in films. So, yeah.
Not that going.
Yeah. So, every person who publicly comes out always says the same thing in one way or another. It's like this huge weight gets lifted off your shoulders. Nobody can come after me now. There's nothing holding me. And so I made it my decision that I would pay back all the goodwill that had been towards me, and I used it to use my position to do a number of things. One was to particularly support the charities. Tim's here. First charity to beat a path to my door, AKT. So I became very proud to become an ambassador for AKT. Opening Doors, I had done a lot of the work in Age Concern to set up Opening Doors. And a number of different organisations I went on to work. I'm now on the board of Give Out, and I'll talk to you a bit more about that later on. But I use my place, or this enormous privilege that I've got in the house to pay back people. And the HIV thing. When I used to work for Age Concern, now Age UK, and we did some of the first work on older people and HIV. Started not by me, but by somebody else. And so way back in 1994, we did work around older people and HIV. So when I went into the house, that was the first APPG that I joined, and I'm still a member, and that's still a subject that's very close to my heart. So I've rambled on a lot.
Yeah, that's what we're here to hear. So yeah, in terms of that, so you spoke there about kind of a large portion of your career actually where you were not out to a degree, obviously colleagues and things you mentioned kind of new. How do you think not being able to be out and not being out affected you as a leader, or affected you in your career?
It's quite clear. There were things that I just couldn't do. I mean, I just could not do things publicly. And I mean, I wasn't resentful about it or anything. It was kind of like, well, that's the way life is. And so I'll have to find another path and do other things. And I suspect that I was not alone. I suspect an awful lot of LGBT people, certainly at that time, didn't become leaders as such, but became very good number twos or backroom people, part of the team. There were exceptions. I mean, there's people like John Brown will talk to you about all the stuff that he did at BP and the enormous strain of keeping it all together. You can't be an authentic leader if you can't be yourself. If you're dragging around all this stuff that you've got to do, you just can't do it. And I think I probably wasn't. I really wasn't that unusual, in that my work colleagues all knew and they were all supportive. My family didn't. Well, they definitely did. I always remember my niece, who was like 4 going on 24, announcing to everybody who wanted to know, "You live with Carol?" "Yeah, I do. Don't tell your gran." So yeah, I just we find ways to cope, and we're very good and we're very creative at finding ways to cope until the time when we can affect change, I think.
For you, that kind of, your story is an amazing example of that, keeping all that in for so long and then to come out during, in such a kind of public fashion, a really kind of pivotal moment for LGBTQ rights in this country during the same-sex marriage debate. Was that slightly nerve-wracking as well?
Yeah, I'd only thought about it every day forever.
Yeah.
The day before it happened, I took Caroline out to Essex. I don't know why. We went to Tilbury. We saw the fort, with Queen Elizabeth. I may have the body of a weakened woman, but I have the army of them. And we drove all the way back from it. And Caroline said, "I hope you've got it out of your system, because I'm not going back to Essex anytime soon." I did. And literally once it was over, and I did go back and watch the film once, and the thing which stands out to me now is the relief, not just for me but for my colleagues who'd kept my secret. And to any of you who are working in organisations where it's not okay to be out, and I think particularly people who are in the church, the amount of pressure on your colleagues who are trying to be kind to you but who are colluding with stuff is something that we as a community sometimes don't quite understand the cost of allyship.
Moving forward to today, so you spoke briefly there about the APPG groups that you're involved in. I was really interested, particularly in your support of kind of global LGBTQ causes, because that's not, it's potentially not an obvious thing to do. Many people, kind of focus on kind of the struggles in front of them in their own kind of countries, and you very deliberately have chosen to kind of widen your view. I just wondered if you kind of had any thoughts about why that was.
We were a colonial power for hundreds of years, and we left a horrible legacy around the Commonwealth. The number of Commonwealth countries in which it is illegal to be gay, which the death penalty is huge. And in our parliament, we have lots and lots of people who come in from all around the world, and we have a duty to help them to get rid of that, that burden. And I've always been. One of the groups that got in touch with me fairly early on was Rainbow Migration. rainbow migration, interesting. They were originally set up because people in the United Kingdom who had partners from abroad their partners couldn't join them, and so this is a bit of old history. People used to go through sham marriages and all that kind of stuff. Those of you who are old enough to remember, the back of the pink paper, there were these little adverts like Brazilian English gay men need to be English Brazilian lesbian, we had to go through this charade. And one of the first things that the Blair government did was they just changed that. They just changed the immigration rules after a lot of campaigning. And therefore the focus of rainbow migration then came to be looking after LGBT migrants, and in the course of my work I talk to a lot of them. I get to travel, not so much now, but I'm very lucky. I get to travel abroad, and when I do go abroad, I always ask, whatever the programme is, I always ask to meet the local LGBT activists. Now, sometimes that's not possible. Ethiopia just wasn't possible. Sometimes it's quite limited. Sitting down in Namibia with a bunch of people having a cup of coffee saying, well, life's crap at the moment, but we'll keep going. And 6 years later, we get change in Namibia. Meeting people from the Balkans who wanted to talk about LGBT youth homelessness and what they do about that. And I've just always seen it as being a crucial part. And I just think I've wound up in this place and in this position that I never in my born days thought I was ever going to do. It's my job to stand up for people who don't have a voice and who don't really the world doesn't get to see them as they are. And so that's, I'm not elected, I can say there, I have an absolute duty to use that position, and that seems to me to be one of the most effective ways to use that.
Yeah, it's hugely courageous of you to do that. I'm sort of struck by what you're saying in terms of sort of, people out there in some of those countries waiting for things to get better. And obviously there's, been times in not too distant history in this country where we've been sat waiting for things to get better. Fortunately, in this country and in some others, it feels like we're sort of waiting to see how bad it's going to get sometimes. And it feels like, for the first time in some people's living memories, the tide of what felt like an inevitable kind of march towards progress has suddenly gone into reverse. Know this is something that you're sort of passionate about. Do you have any kind of thoughts on, why that's happening and really what needs to be done about it?
Yeah, because I think what happened was ever since the Second World War, there was a progression towards human rights and universal human rights. And as the reason for that, the causes of that in the Second World War fade, there are people, institutions who have always fundamentally disagreed with the notion of human rights, seeing it as being incompatible with their belief systems. And they have decided to oppose that. And they sat and waited their time. They've been very, very clever. They've watched the progress of human rights, and they have plotted it and charted it. And they have taken the language of human rights and they have colonized it and inverted it to make it that those of us who support human rights are this big liberal elite who are busy oppressing people like them, ordinary people like them. And they have identified a number of specific tactical grounds on which to fight: anti-LGBT stuff, anti-relationships and sex education, anti-abortion, particularly anti-trans, anti-surrogacy. All these things that they have they see as being key touchstone wedge issues. And they have built a whole narrative around them that women and children and the men who try to defend them and their families are being oppressed by this liberal elite. And it's very clever, it's very, very well funded, and it's very cynical. And they have a lot of money, and they are brilliantly organised, brilliantly. It started off in the sort of the genesis of the campaign was in Europe, but it was picked up by evangelical American organisations, and they've turbocharged it. And they have all their messaging and all their money all come, and it all gets fed through. And we, I think, got lulled into a false sense of security that progress would be linear, it would be inevitable, people would understand things, and we just didn't see them coming. We should have done. We should have sat there and watched the 40-year campaign that they had to overturn Roe versus Wade, and we should have seen how all of the tactics of that were then going to be turned around and used against us, and how clever they had been at dividing, finding ways to divide our side of the argument. So it is difficult. It is enormously difficult particularly for our trans brothers and sisters. I think they are in the most horrendous situation. And I don't underestimate how hard it is, but I do see some glimmers of hope, but they are, as a moment, glimmers of hope, and we need to study the enemy, because I think they are our enemies. I've got no qualms about saying that. We need to study what they've done, we need to work out how they've done it, and we need to begin to get organised to counteract it. And we can do it. I think the good news is that when people who are not, I think when the true extent and the true purpose of this campaign becomes obvious, and people really realise what it's all about, it's not as popular as people think.
Yeah, I was in San Francisco the day that Roe was overturned. Yeah, it was there to march in pride. It was such a stark kind of wake-up call for me, I think, to have that kind of contrast between being able to do something like that and then seeing, the shocking kind of news happen and the reaction of people there. It was just this sort of cloud of depression of the entire city. It was kind of powerful. If you hadn't heard the news, you would have walked out and thought something is badly wrong. It was a real wake-up call. I talked a lot, so I figure maybe we'll open it up for questions from the audience. I've got
Ms. Barker, I know what you've done for our community, and you've been very humble in what you've said. I've seen everything you've done every step of the way, and you've stood out, and you've been bold where other people couldn't be. So I want to acknowledge that first of all. But you've seen the global picture, and I think that's the biggest worry, because I think we're going in a direction where it doesn't matter what happens in the change of government here, what is happening globally is quite scary. What do you think is the single most important change that could happen globally to increase the rights of LGBTQ plus people?
We have to get organised. It makes me laugh. When Putin and all that go on about this internationally organised gay conspiracy. Well, I wish. I really do. We're not. We're not organised at all. I use an analogy. I say our enemy, they are really, really well organised, well-resourced army, and we're all bloody foxholes, so each of us trying to fend. So I would like us to the single important thing is to get organised. And in order to do a very important thing, which is to expose what the ultimate aim of this campaign is about. And there are reasons to be hopeful. They didn't win in Australia 2 years ago when they tried all this stuff. They didn't win in Poland. The Republicans are getting hammered and have been ever since the overturning of Roe versus Wade in America, because people actually understand what the consequences of all of this are. I don't for a moment believe that individuals and people of faith should not be allowed to be anti-abortion. I really don't. But if we don't have fully accessible reproductive health care, the implications of that for the health of women and for the planet is immense. Yeah. And I should have maybe made it a bit more obvious that I do a lot of things with schools and colleges, and they come into Parliament, and I described all the work that I do as a peer one day, and I love it with doing schools things because they don't care, they just ask whatever they like. And the school just said, "Why do you do it?" And I thought, what a bloody good question that is. You know, so, what do you actually care about? And what I really do, and I've always cared about, is about women in particular, but also men, but particularly women, having control of their own bodies, of their own fate, having able to determine whether they're going to have an education, get a job. That's the thing that I meant to, and I keep going back to that. It's one of the first things I did at university was to speak up in the student union against one of the many attempts there have been to narrow down David Steele's 1967 Abortion Act. That's an absolutely fundamental thing. If a woman can't be in charge of her own reproductive health, she can't work, she can't be productive. That's the really important stuff. And actually, I'm not alone in being really passionate about that. And the more that we make those connections for people, the easier it will be to stop us all being picked on.
How do you organise? And particularly, how do you organise when the people in the room have a tendency to tear each other apart on the minutiae of the issues that they differ on rather than the collective issues? How do you organise in those circumstances? Because for me, it feels like when we try and come together for a greater purpose, we end up ripping each other apart and not doing anything because we're arguing about which pronouns we're using or which rainbow flag we're using. We get lost in the detail rather than being able to pull ourselves out to the macro and the bigger issue.
Welcome to the democratic left. Isn't that always our story? I think it's quite interesting. I think that we do and we don't. When it matters, we actually do put aside our differences. You know, to be frank with you, there are some things about the LGBT community that I don't like. I keep stum about them, you know. And we've always in the past, I think we were so busy putting up a protective shield around us all that we never did have those discussions internally. And now, because the big campaign against us has got trans rights as a wedge issue, they have identified it as a wedge issue. They have got us where they want us, which is at each other's throats. And unless and until we explain to the rest of the community what is being done to us and why, then we don't have the space to heal that rift. I think in the meantime, it is the job of those of us who have the means to point it out, to kind of, it's our job to say, actually, have you thought about this big picture? And we keep doing that for a while until pennies begin to drop.
My name is Alex. I am a trans man and was very much involved in the campaign for trans equalities back in the day. I'm very interested in the whole point about autonomy and people being entitled to equal rights, equal respect, being allowed to do what you want. It's a liberal argument. Do what you like as long as it doesn't hurt others. And by analogy, really, I was very involved in that, but then I was much more involved in my professional life in the human rights of black and Asian people and other so-called ethnic minorities across the Greater Manchester City region. And now, of course, more recently with asylum seekers, I prefer to call refugees, really. And then a wider connection, again, is with nature and the rights of non-human creatures and living things on this planet. And I see the same enemy that you speak of at work in all of those places, using exactly the same tactics. I suspect they may be the same people. And I feel like there must be, the big message that we need to get out there is about we're all in this together. And nobody can survive unless everybody survives, and that goes for trees as well. And I think it's a very inclusive message and a very accepting message. Do you have any thoughts? Have you thought yourself about the kind of wider implications of this enemy that you've analysed quite thoroughly with regard to LGBTQ and so on, about how they're operating in other fields, because you may know more than I do?
Okay. I think you're right that there is a pattern of argument. You know, the people who are putting forward the anti-green argument are doing, you know, there's all these fancy liberals who are, you know, doing all this stuff, and you can't afford it, can you? And all that. Do I have an answer to that? Yes and no. I think if we let it get too big, we'll just put our hands up and say, I can't cope with all of this. I think it is from our side breaking it down into bits and pieces that we can deal with. And I think the important thing, it took us 50 years of campaigning to get to partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, and then to go all through that. And we did it bit by bit by bit, getting the message through to all sorts of people about what was happening and why we were not an enemy and why it was not. And I think we carry on doing that. We make the connections in ways that enable individuals to come to the issue and make sense of it. Somebody in South Manchester understanding what the impact of environmental harm is for them is the one thing I would say is that I am on the board of Give Out, which I will plug shamelessly because I'm really. And Give Out, basically what we do is we take money out of all of us here who live in a place of great privilege. And don't get more privilege than where I work. But actually, I had to do this. I had to do an event in the beginning of December last year, and I stood up in a room full of people in Germany. And they knew two things about me. They knew I was a Baroness and that the night before I'd thrown a party for Elton John. And I had to stand up and both of which were true. And I had to say to them, well, you probably think I've got more money than God. I don't, unfortunately. I don't. But 2 generations back, my family were steel workers and miners. And when there was no work, they were economic migrants. Me, today, I sit in one of those privileged places. I was so lucky. I grew up in a country where my healthcare was free, my education was free. I was a woman, was expected to be able to go to work. I didn't have anybody forcing me to get married, not get married, have children, whatever. And all of that happened not by accident. It happened over decades when people came together to fight for all of those things. And it's why now those of us who have the privilege of doing what we do, having the freedom to access information and the internet, have to put our money where our mouth is and get the money to people who are fighting for LGBT human rights around the world. And in Give Out, we're doing that in lots and lots of different ways. I'm happy to bore you about at length. But one of the things that we're doing is I think we've set up the first ever LGBT climate change fund, because we think there is reason to believe that climate change will disproportionately affect marginalised people, and in lots of countries that's ours, and we've got examples of that around the world. So you're right, we who've got the privilege and the information and the knowledge, we keep putting it all putting the big picture together in ways that make sense to people wherever they are. That was long.
Hi, Baroness Barker. Firstly, thank you so much for that. I'm Kat. I'm a co-chair of Proud Along with Shireen and Ryan, who are here. Firstly, thank you so much on behalf of Shoes Vincent Proud for being here today and sharing your insightful story. My question is around, you've touched upon the trans wedge between the community at the moment, and I think that's definitely something organisations like Shoesmiths are trying to address and kind of work towards how we can be better allies within our own community. And I just wanted your thoughts on what can we, I say we being the LGBT and plus, I suppose, section of that demographic, be doing to support our trans colleagues and peers, whether out or not, because I do think that as you've alluded to, the progress in that regard is sort of 20 years or so behind sometimes, it feels.
Yeah, I think, well, number one, I help my trans friends get up every day, and I do not underestimate the battering that they are taking psychologically, and I think being there for trans people is really important. On a day, this week, the latest nonsense about the LSA. Secondly, I think we need to help them to organise and to get their, to have a strategic organisation. I am a bit concerned that there are lots and lots of little trans organisations, and they might all get washed away. So we need to help them to organise themselves. Third thing, I think we never go anywhere without them. I stand up and talk about trans people in Parliament, and somebody quite rightly had a go at me and said, "Oh, why do you do that?" Because there's nobody else. And believe me, I will be delighted when the first trans people come into Parliament and they can speak for themselves. But until they can, then it's my job to stand up and help. And the other thing that I think that we must do is we just have to do the job that people did for us as LGBT, which is to explain to everybody else, we are not a threat, we never have been, we really are not, neither are trans people. And the more that you can demonstrate that in your lived ordinary life and your working life, the better.
I was just interested, I know you mentioned working for Open Doors London and Age Concern, and some of the division in the community that you talked about, I think, is partly exacerbated by like a lack of connection between younger and older LGBTQ plus people and different kind of experiences, material experiences as well. Just curious about what you think we can do to create more solidarity between those groups and kind of facilitate those connections, particularly when it's a really difficult environment for charities to operate and lots of the things that government might have been doing and they're not doing. So just curious to hear more about that.
My name's Trevor. I'm been involved in the supporter side of football for God knows how long. but founder member of Pride in Football, and I'm currently on the committee of Pride of Irons, which is the West Ham LGBTQ plus supporters group. So
You're
West
doing
Ham.
so well up to that point.
I know it's sadness, but you know, once you become one, you're stuck with it. Yeah. I mean, I was 8 years old when I went to my first game, so it's like a virus. Never mind. Well, I'm living with it. But with that, we've got a zero tolerance to any hate chanting. But it seems to be on the increase regardless. West Ham, through Pride of Irons, working with Kick It Out, we've got a system of restorative justice where we will suspend banning with the court support and the police if they go through this thing. But they talk to us and victims of other hate crimes and things. So why do you think the hate crime is increasing? And what do you think we can do about it, apart from small things like we're trying at West Ham?
Let's be quite honest about it. We are one of the most ageist groups there are. Ageism is absolutely rife in our community. And I'll be honest with you, I think gay men get the worst of that. They really do. I'm really sorry that Opening Doors has had to close. It was a real blow. The trustees did what they could. Some of the services have gone to other places. I think we are now growing older as a community and having more people who are visibly older within the community and involving them in all of the different community groups that we've got. We've got a lot of people who are ageing with HIV. We've got people who are getting older in terms of sport, and we've got to grow up and as a community. We're changing and we're evolving. I mean, we don't now have, when I was a kid, we always used to say in the old days, gay people were really fit because all we had was discos and marches. There was nothing else. But nowadays, we get to do all sorts of things, but we can grow and we can begin to address that ageism ourselves. And I think that in places like Brighton, where I go, there are a lot more visibly older people, and welcoming them in is an important thing to do. And keeping oral histories going, that's a really big thing too. On the sport thing, I know that the anti-trans brigade have picked sport as one of their weapons. I personally think that as a community we were getting so much better, and I always acknowledge, I have to acknowledge it as an Oldham athletic supporter, that there are people in this world who are not so fortunate. And I also think for a good part of our community, sport was something that was traumatic because of school, and they just didn't want to go anywhere near it at all. I think that we, same as I kept saying, we keep being visible. Even when we get knocked back, we keep being visible, because however hateful they are, and a lot of it is fanned by anonymity of social media and stuff like that, we just have to keep it and not let them get us down, and support each other when there's a pile-on and all of that. And we can weather this, and it will get better. It really will get better, because we have the right side of history. We have. I often say when I'm in the sort of city places and that, the thing about discrimination, it's incredibly expensive. It's a bit of a luxury, really. And actually, in these days, none of us can afford the luxury of discrimination and hatred. So we've got not only the moral argument, but we've also got the economic argument. And when the chips are down, that's what works.
Just wanted to pick up on what you said before around the need for us to get organised, and I've really been kind of reflecting on that whilst listening. And you know, we do have in Pride and Leadership a network of over 2,000 leaders from kind of all sectors, you know, many different levels of seniority, and it's really, I think it's worth us all kind of thinking, perhaps as we kind of move into the networking portion of the evening, about, you know, the kind of power that we have in this room to make change and affect change, particularly if we get together in these spaces. So one of the really, the key reason I think Claire and me started Pride and Leadership is because we worked together for about 3 years and neither of us knew each other were gay. We thought, well, what hope have we got of actually getting organised if we don't even know, you know, our kind of peers in the LGBTQ community in a kind of work context. So yeah, that's something to think about. And Liz, I know you and I share a real interesting kind of organisational psychology and leadership, and we've got a lot of leaders and aspiring leaders in the room. So on a slightly lighter note, I wondered, do you have a kind of a top tip or kind of, you know, interesting thought that you've heard recently on the topic of leadership and leadership practice for people in the room?
I'll come to that. One thing that I would say, and I've taken to saying a lot recently, I sit in, you know, I'm in Parliament, and lots of people come into Parliament, and I've been quite robust, particularly with the voluntary organisation. Do not send me another bunch of people telling me how crap it is to be LGBT somewhere in the world. I know that. I really do. Our enemies do not sit around and tell each other what the problem is. They sit around and think, what works? What worked there? What didn't work there? What are we going to take? What are we going to learn? What are we going to replicate? Okay? And we need to start doing that. And if you've got a network of people who can think like that about what we're facing, then we need to marshal them and get them to work. I often think that the greatest thing about leadership, I often watch great leaders and they do two things. They have an amazing awareness of the people around them. And they don't think about what they are going to say, they think about what those people are going to hear. And they communicate in that way. And the second thing that they do is that they always have a great number two. Because they recognise their own limitations. And over my time in watching people, the really, really great leaders do those two things really well. They do lots of other things, but they do those two things really well.
Excellent.
Thank you. Well, it really helped me in thanking you, not just for phenomenally interesting talk tonight, but all of the absolutely unbelievable work you've been doing for so many years to support us and the rest of the LGBTQ community. Baroness Liz Barker.